Imagine a world where phones and computers stop functioning. Automotive assembly lines go silent. Communication gets disrupted globally. This would be our world if it was devoid of the tiny chip. Semiconductor chips are small but critical, integral to all networked devices that have become embedded in our lives. The technology enables advances in communication, computing, transportation, and countless other applications. Programmed with software, the chip practically powers every electronic device that we own today. Cars, laptops, smartphones, washing machines and refrigerators, modern manufacturing plants and warehouses. Electronics used in defense equipment and weaponry are all dependent on the semiconductor chip. The humble chip has reached every corner of our lives. So what happens if this most powerful but tiny item runs out of production? There will be chaos. Can a country do anything to avert that? Well, either one waits in the queue, hoping that supply lines meet the demand soon, or you take the plunge and start building the tiny component. So, where is India in the semiconductor race?
We have skilled manpower. Second is the fact that government policies have been very, very friendly to create electronic manufacturing hubs in the country, whether it be specs or whether it be the PLI, and whether it be 5 other policy initiatives that are taking us there.
We are preparing a package of incentives to become a key manufacturer of semiconductors.
On the 15th of December 2021, in a bid to boost the semiconductor ecosystem in the country, the Government of India announced an ambitious new incentive scheme worth 76,000 crore Indian rupees, or nearly $10.2 billion. Prime Minister Narendra Modi urged the industry to make India a global hub for semiconductors. However, is India really seizing the opportunity?
People often call the packaging of chips as manufacturing or made in India chips and so on, which in my opinion is not good enough. You need to actually fabricate the chips in India, and that is when we can call ourselves to be truly Atmanirbhar as far as semiconductor and electronics manufacturing is concerned. It will take time.
Now, why didn't TSMC and everyone jump in the fray at that time? They also are looking for some of the support from the government, infrastructure support from the government. Government needs to do a little bit more to actually, allay the fears. Like, for example, when we see iPhone being produced here, it gives a confidence to the global ecosystem that India can produce a high technology item like Apple iPhones. And I'm sure with the laptop incentive scheme in play around from November onwards.
Can India realize its semiconductor aspirations? Which are other prominent players in the space? And what are the factors that will determine if India can become a chip powerhouse? Let's look at some figures first. Semiconductor is a high-stakes game. In terms of money, its market size was pegged at $600 billion in 2021 by McKinsey and is projected to grow to $1 trillion by 2030. Be it the US, Europe, Japan, Korea, or India, everyone wants to have a share of the pie. According to a report, India's semiconductor market was valued at $27.2 billion in 2021 and is expected to reach $64 billion in 2026. However, none of the chips have been manufactured in India so far. In keeping with Prime Minister Narendra Modi's vision of Atmanirbhar Bharat, or a self-reliant India, And to cut dependence on imports from regions like Taiwan and China, the government brought a financial incentive scheme for manufacturing semiconductors in the country. In September 2022, India hailed the building of a semiconductor manufacturing plant in Gujarat as a landmark. It was a joint venture between Indian metals to oil conglomerate Vedanta and Taiwan-based electronics contract manufacturing company Foxconn. A Memorandum of Understanding or MOU was signed with the Gujarat government to set up separate chip and display manufacturing plants in the state of Gujarat. The estimated cost was $19.5 billion, and the two firms were set to jointly invest the amount.
A lot of work went into putting this entire deal together. The government of India itself contributed very dramatically to bringing together partners. And the government of India created the ecosystem within which this entire manufacturing could actually go places. Locations were sought out, locations were finalized.
So this partnership, obviously was a highlight for India's manufacturing prowess to showcase to the world in terms of silicon, which is very tricky to actually make your mark in that particular space.
The biggest ever corporate investment in the history of independent India, the Vedanta-Foxconn joint venture, came to an abrupt halt. On July 10th, Taiwan-based Honhai Technology Group, better known as Foxconn, pulled out of the joint venture with Vedanta. The firm announced in a statement, and I quote, "In order to explore more diverse development opportunities, according to mutual agreement, Foxconn has determined it will not move forward in the joint venture with Vedanta." It did not elaborate on the reasons. However, concerns about the joint venture had started surfacing since the beginning of the year. Reports suggested that the joint venture was struggling to tie up with a technology partner. News agency Reuters reported that the Vedanta-Foxconn project was proceeding slowly as their talks to involve European chipmaker ST Microelectronics as a partner were deadlocked. Factors like tech transfer, partnership time and fund investments were cited for the delay. Additionally, Vedanta has been plagued by a rising debt pile, raising doubts about its ability to pay for manufacturing-grade technology. Will the fallout between Vedanta and Foxconn be a setback to India's chip-making ambitions? Let's hear what the experts have to say.
Either they needed yet another technology partner, a high-volume manufacturing silicon fab of repute, or they needed a production-grade technology license. It is not clear who might have pulled the plug first, but it is rather clear that Foxconn was never the sufficient partner to get approved for a high volume silicon chip manufacturing fab in India. And for Foxconn too, Vedanta hardly brought any value except for being their India partner, which might be an advantage when applying for an incentive scheme in India.
It's about 30-50 years kind of investment, and things like water and sand and silica, those are the important things. So the expertise in this high technology space is very important. None of these players had much expertise. Vedanta certainly did not have. Foxconn has been in the electronics manufacturing, but certainly not in this space. At least in a joint venture, you need one partner who will have the expertise of this particular high technology kind of stuff. So I think it was always slightly tricky that this will work, how this will work, how long will it work. But at least before the start of the venture or anything, we came to know that both the parties could not agree on some of the things.
According to sources at the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, Vedanta Foxconn was planning to manufacture 40 nanometer chips, which are a few decades old, as opposed to its initial plans of setting up a 28 nanometer process, which faces roadblocks over finding a technology partner. So the question is, if Foxconn and Vedanta did not have the expertise, how did they sign such a massive deal?
Historically, electronic manufacturing has had a very big base in India, and Bengaluru itself was one of them. If you look at it, but over a period of time, this was ignored. Now what happens is there's a re-invoking with government policy. So when the government announces something big, the small guys just don't, come up, and the small guys are not able to float. Typically, what happens is the biggies from across the globe look at it and say that maybe I can piggyback on everything that's coming up.
I don't think that should be, we should read too much into it. That's a good step. They could have started there and ended up probably at 10, 15 nanometer. It takes a lot. That's a big step to move generation to generation. Even giants like Intel and TSMC also take some time. So obviously, we can't expect them to do it in the first step in itself. It will take much more specific investment by the government in this.
Also, why didn't India's incentive scheme attract direct and big players like Intel and Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, better known as TSMC?
We will see these kind of players coming here. But from TSMC's point of view, 60% of the world chipset is still produced in Taiwan. TSMC is about 70% plus of the capacity of the chipset. It's difficult for them to move base or even start investing somewhere else. And obviously, there are some geopolitical tensions also there. How would, India versus China, and then Taiwan comes into the fray. So we have Intel, we have NVIDIA, we have AMD and other stuff who have really good expertise in this. I think some of those players in the ecosystem, they need to start looking at it. Why India is not being seen? I think it's being seen. That's why the Foxconn and Vedanta JV was announced in the first place. The government is making the right kind of moves. We still have a long way to go.
India has missed the boat for almost 30, 40 years. We are not yet what I call as a proven ground for high volume silicon fabs. And so giants will probably hesitate. They may want to see something smaller or something of lesser complication proven first. For example, what is called as a mature node fab, like a 65 nanometer or a 45 nanometer fab, which has enough market for analog chips and power chips and microcontrollers and so on and so forth. So if one of them gets proven in India, we show that we can manage the infrastructure and the skill and everything and the quality that is needed for fabs, then some of these giants will show interest, is what I feel.
These tiny chips are today's new oil. Semiconductors have become an economic battlefield. It's a global competition. China has poured billions of dollars into building the technology to manufacture semiconductors. The US has taken a host of steps to thwart Chinese ambitions. It is about to unleash $52 billion in funding to accelerate the development of a domestic supply chain for semiconductors. This will benefit several companies, including Intel. South Korea has also announced its plans to build an enormous facility to make computer chips, with about $230 billion in investment from memory chip giant Samsung Electronics.
Overall, the semiconductor market globally is hovering around the 600 billion mark. It increased in 2022 substantially, followed by an expectation of a small dip in 2023 and a recovery in 2024. In all of this, India is near zero, and we can only hope that by 2030 or 2035, if there are 2 or 3 high volume silicon fabs in India, we get to a 1 or 2% market share. Nowhere close to what can be called as a semiconductor manufacturing hub or anything. That's an over exaggeration, but a 1 or 2% market share by 2030s, 35 will be a success.
Unfortunately, India's semiconductor journey is peppered with some missed opportunities, but the government recognizes the economic and geopolitical significance of this industry. Its semiconductor dreams aren't over yet. Far from it, in fact. The second edition of Semicon India took place in Gandhinagar, Gujarat in July. Organized by India's Semiconductor Mission, the 3-day conference came at a critical time. It brought together the who's who of the semiconductor world, global leaders from industry, academia, and research institutions. The idea was to introduce them to India's semiconductor strategy and policy. It was accompanied by a 5-day exhibition aimed at exposing students to the exciting world of chips.
भारत को इस बात का भी एहसास है कि सेमीकंडक्टर सिर्फ हमारी जरूरत ही नहीं है, दुनिया को भी आज एक ट्रस्टेड, रिलायबल चिप सप्लाई चेन की जरूरत है। दुनिया की सबसे बड़ी डेमोक्रेसी से बेहतर भला ये ट्रस्टेड पार्टनर और कौन हो सकता है।
The government has made a fresh bid to attract major global chip manufacturers into the country, and it is yielding results. In June, American chipmaker Micron Technology said it will set up a $2.75 billion semiconductor testing and assembly facility in India. The plant will be established in 2 phases. The first phase involves the construction of an assembly facility in Gujarat. It is scheduled to begin later this year. The second phase is expected to be implemented in the second half of this decade. Micron will invest $825 million directly, with the remaining to be contributed by the central and state governments. The company says the plant will create up to 5,000 new direct jobs and 15,000 community jobs over the next several years. Immediately after the computer storage chip maker made this announcement, its rival Applied Materials also announced a $400 billion investment to build an engineering center in Bengaluru. These developments hold a lot of promise for India's manufacturing push. It also has an opportunity to cash in on global companies' efforts to build factories outside India. Coined in 2013, China Plus One, also known as Plus One, is a business strategy to avoid investing only in China and diversify business into other countries. The tactic started becoming popular in 2018 and gained prominence after the COVID pandemic. But why was this strategy required in the first place? That's because for the last 3 decades, Western companies have invested heavily in China due to its low labor and production costs. This led to an over-concentration of business interests in China. The world is now looking to reduce their dependence on China. And this opens up a huge opportunity for India. But is it seizing it? What are the hurdles that need to be tackled?
Certainly, one of the challenges is the red tape, the continuing red tape. And I know India has grappled with that for decades. And after liberation of the economy in 1991, I know the Indian government made efforts to cut down on the red tape, but it's still there. And some of it has become more informalized. Maybe not as overt, but that is difficult. Corruption is an issue. Over in China, Xi Jinping came to power and become quite popular in his anti-corruption program. And so that's an issue as well. But if we put those aside, let's just look at infrastructure. One of the advantages that China had is it built up very good infrastructure, that is ports, railways, highways, river transportation. There is no reason why India cannot do the same.
Historically, we have been a country where, because our supply side is so weak, right, access to industrial land, access to talent has been modest in India. You sort of get 2 good years in India, maybe 3 good years, and even with a little bit of foreign money, inflation takes off through the ceiling. Right? Labor costs go through the roof, land costs go through the roof, corruption kicks in, and the economy then chokes itself out. We've seen that twice, in the mid-90s and in the mid-noughties. 3 years of good foreign money and India overheats. If we can get our supply side sorted out, access to industrial land, access to talent, if that can be resolved, then we will have a longer run of foreign money coming in without inflation taking off.
According to World Bank chief Ajay Banga, India has a limited window of opportunity to attract investment.
China is out of COVID now, and China wants its business back in a big, big way. China doesn't want China plus one thinking at all. And I think, China wants to insulate itself, and therefore China will go all out. So the ability to compete with China and South Korea in particular, leaving Vietnam aside, is going to be a part of the key competence development for India. Because global majors are going to have bids and pitches, and these are country level pitches. And I think in these country level pitches, we should be able to position India in a solid manner.
Microchips are increasingly viewed as the biggest geopolitical reward. The trade war between the US and China centers around semiconductors. The chip war is still escalating. And at the heart of this conflict lies the tiny island of Taiwan. Both countries realize their dependence on Taiwan, the world leader in manufacturing microchips. Taiwan produces more than 60% of semiconductors globally and more than 90% of the most advanced ones. The US share of the market is only around 12%, and the European nations together account for just 9%. More than 90% of semiconductors used in China are imported or manufactured locally by foreign suppliers, with Taiwan being a critical supply source. A 2022 report said Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company Limited has around 55% of the global market for contract chip fabrication. So where does India feature on the global chip manufacturing map? It has the political will and is dreaming big. New Delhi has positioned itself as a player in the critical semiconductor technology field. But it must overcome the challenges to forge ahead and become a global chip-making hub.